So let's see if you can remember some of the functions from the previous section. What are the functions of the bone? Well, some of the easier ones are support and protection, making red blood cells, but also as a place to deposit minerals and toxins, and also to maintain some electrolyte balance because all those minerals are stored in the bone. What are the shapes of the bones? So we had shapes that were like long bone, short bone, irregular, flat, sesamoid, and wormian or suture bones. So there's like 6. See if you can name all of those. What cell destroys bone? What builds bone? The cells that destroy the bone are, you should say, bone destroyers would be the osteoclasts with a C, and the bone builders, that would be the osteoblasts with a B. So what is a perforating canal? Perforating canal is the ones that go at right angles to the central canal. Lamellae or lamella, those are the rings, the concentric rings around the central canal or around the whole of the bone, like around the circumference of the bone. Calcitonin, what does it do to calcium blood levels? Calcitonin is going to decrease because it's going to decrease the blood levels because it's going to deposit more bone onto the more calcium onto the bone, and so building the bone builders are increasing bone. The osteoblasts, the bone builders, are going to be increased or stimulated, and the osteoclasts are going to be inhibited. So what does PTH do? The opposite. Basically, it's going to stimulate the osteoclasts, increase the blood calcium levels, and it would inhibit the osteoblasts from depositing more bone. Some other chemicals that affect bone growth, we said, let you think about that. So we had several hormones like estrogen, testosterone, growth hormone. All of those are going to have something to do with the development of bones, and especially during puberty, like bone building, bone growth. T3 and T4, if you break a bone, they're going to have to do with bone, like the metabolism, but so they're going to increase the ability to heal the bone. And the other chemicals like calcitriol is vitamin D. That's going to also be similar or work similar to the calcitonin, because it's calcitriol is going to be like vitamin D, and it's going to help absorb more calcium, and so you have calcitriol is going to be reabsorption of calcium, or absorption of calcium at the beginning. So it's going to it's going to inhibit the bone builders, the osteoblasts. It's going to increase the osteoclast activity. It's going to help the kidneys reabsorb as much of the calcium as possible so you don't excrete as much calcium, and phosphates as well, and also absorb as much calcium as you can. So it has effects on multiple organ systems. So now we're ready for chapter 9. This is the joints. So what is a joint? It is an attachment of two bones. So where two bones come together, you can see the hands here. This is someone who has arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, how they've kind of fused. There's no actual articulations or spaces between the bones, so they've become fused into one big bone. Arth is a root word that's associated with joints, so arthritis is the inflammation of those joints. So what are the different classifications? So one way we can classify them is by their freedom of movement, how easily you can move. So functionally, This would be a way to classify them functionally. And we have diarthrosis, which is freely moving. This would be like our synovial joints. Then we have amphiarthrosis, which is limited amounts of movement. And then we have synarthrosis, which is no movement. So a suture is an suture is synarthrosis. This is called the joint between the alveolar process here and the tooth, which is actually not a bone. It doesn't contain bone. It's covered in enamel, so it looks white, but it isn't bone itself. So it does have these little ligaments that are holding it in place, and it has a nerve that goes into the middle of the tooth, and all these sensitivities, little nerve endings here too, to detect like how hard you're pressing down when you chew. Just not pressing too hard so you break a tooth, but just enough that you need to cut the meat or whatever it is that you're chewing. And so anyway, this little joint here, the alveolar processes and the tooth, that is a gomphosis. And what's interesting about this is that it's amphi or synarthrosis, but mostly amphiarthrosis, which you wouldn't think that the teeth move. But they do, just a little bit, and it's a little flexible so that there can be some, and you can detect, how much you're chewing, how much you're clamping down with your jaw on food, so you don't break a tooth. So there is some detection of how much you are actually chewing there. Then there's a syndesmosis here that's sort of synarthrosis, but amphiarthrosis, it's sort of both. Synarthrosis or amphiarthrosis. So really the only freely movable ones are the synovial, which are not any of these. So joints are classified by how, this is the structural, not by how much they move, but what they're made up of. So fibrous joints are held together by ligaments, which is dense connective tissue. Ligaments join bone to bone, tendons join muscle to bone. So we're talking about ligaments here. Cartilaginous are going to be held together either by hyaline or fibrocartilage. So there's different ones, some that are hyaline and some that are fibrocartilage. But these are not synovial. The third type is synovial, and these have a joint cavity. They are diarthrosis, but that's not what makes them in this category. They have a synovial membrane, which forms the joint cavity, and they also have other structures that anchor the bones together and reduce friction. So the things that reduce friction would be like hyaline cartilage. So what differentiates a cartilaginous from a synovial joint is the joint cavity. They both may have some cartilage, but the one that has the joint cavity is the synovial joint. So you have sutures, gomphosis, and syndesmosis that we were showing you earlier. So there are little fibers in each of these. The sutures even have little fibers between the bones if you can look at them magnified. And there's little fibers you can see connecting the tooth to the alveolar processes. And then you have these fibers that are going between the bones. And this is the distal end of the radial and ulnar joint. And so that's a syndesmosis, which is a really weird one that you may never have heard of before or didn't realize this, but that kind of holds them together because the upper portion, the proximal portion that's near the elbow, is going to be really supinating, but this holds them in a kind of plane so that they don't leave that plane So 3 different kinds of fibrous. So all of these are fibrous because they have fibers joining them together. So fibrous connective tissue. Synchondrosis and symphysis, these are cartilaginous. And this would be the cartilage between them. So the only, like, synchondrosis is this first rib with the sternum. And so it's weird, but the actual joints down here are not a synchondrosis. It's just this first one with the sternum. So it's this one in particular. There is some costal cartilage and there is some, I don't know, joint cavities in these lower ones, but the only synchondrosis is this one up here with the number 1 and the it's between the ribs and the sternum. That's basically, and so there's cartilage that connects them. So I think all of these actually are it, except for the 2 floating ones, not those, but the ones that are connected by cartilage to the sternum in some way, those would be synchondrosis. And then symphysis is like there's the intervertebral discs. Those are made of fibrocartilage. If you throw a disc or you have a bulging disc, that can cause some back problems. But this is fibrocartilage between them, but it is cartilage. Pubic symphysis is another place where you see this between the pubic bones, and that is also fibrocartilage. So these would be a symphysis, and this would be a synchondrosis, but these are cartilaginous. Now, synovial joints, those are all going to have some sort of a joint cavity. And when I was trying to show this, we didn't have a good picture of this because it wasn't working. So that's one of the reasons why I'm doing this today. But you can see this is all joint cavity. It's made of synovial membranes and some fibrous capsule around it. And then you do have some ligaments and you do have some articular cartilages that kind of are at the surface here where they articulate directly. But those are all part of the typical joint. And so in between the fingers, these are synovial joints. Or in between, like your interphalangeal, there's a proximal phalanx and a middle phalanx. And so this is in between a proximal and a middle finger bone phalanx. And so synovial is a modified serous membrane that envelops the ends of both bones. And so it's kind of covering around that whole thing. It secretes and reabsorbs synovial fluid, which is very frictionless. It's the most frictionless substance known to man. Articular cartilage is the pad of the hyaline cartilage that covers the epiphysis. So you can see that articular cartilage here. And ligaments is a dense connective tissue that extends from the periosteum of one bone to another. So it's it's an extension off of the periosteum of one phalanx, and it becomes part of the next phalanx. So other structures, the meniscus is usually this little pad here that absorbs, this little cartilage, fibrocartilage that will absorb shock. There's also, and cushions it, divides the joint space. The bursa is this little area here, little fluid-filled space. There's a couple of them. On the front of the patella is the prepatellar bursa, and then you have a superficial patellar bursa, so it's kind of below. There's also a deep infrapatellar bursa. So there's superficial and deep infrapatellar, so it's below the patella. And then we have one that's on the back of the head of the gastrocnemius, and or under the lateral head of the gastrocnemius. So there's another bursa there on the back, but we have a lot of them around the knee, and if those get inflamed, if there's an inflammation, it's called bursitis. So you could have tennis elbow if your bursa is inflamed. So bursa, synovial fluid-filled sac that cushions and divides the joint. So again, just protection, these meniscus and bursa. And then there's adipose that forms a thick pad that cushions and fills the spaces within the joint. So you just wherever there's some spaces, it's going to be filled with something. It's not going to just be air. So you got some fat, adipose tissue. So you've got, again, some prepatellar bursa here. And then there's the infrapatellar. Ooh, here's the suprapatellar. Infrapatellar's down here. And then the prepatellar is just in front of it. And then there's the back of that, or under the gastrocnemius, lateral head of the gastrocnemius. On the knee joint, you have different ligaments, and they have all different kinds of names. So you may have heard of your ACL. So AC is anterior cruciate ligament. So that's your ACL. You also have, so there's an anterior one that goes this way. There's also a posterior cruciate ligament that goes this way, and together they form a little X or a cross, so that's why it's called a cruciate ligament. So they go from, like one goes from the lateral condyle to the medial condyle of the tibia. One goes from the medial condyle to the lateral condyle of the tibia. And so they crisscross. And then you have your side ones, which are collateral ligaments. So you have a fibular collateral ligament, and you have a tibular collateral ligament. And there's also a patellar ligament that goes across the patella to hold the patella in place. So there's a lot of different ligaments here, and a lot of knee injuries are related to one of these ligaments getting torn. So then different types of synovial joints. So there's just so many examples of these. I've only given like one for each of these different kinds, but we'll try and unpack a few of these. So a hinge joint, you're going to have one direction that it moves. This, one plane of movement. So it's a monaxial, one plane of movement. And the hinge joint would be at the humeral ulnar, which would be your elbow. It's also going to be at your knee. It's also going to be found in your fingers, so interphalangeal. So there's like 3 places where you're typically going to see that. Your gliding joints are going to be between 2 fairly flat surfaces, one that's concave and one that's convex. And so convex is here and concave is here, but they're sort of flat. And so those are gliding or plane joints. Then you have the condyloid joint is a very specific one. So this is not between the phalangeal, as I had kind of looked at before, but this is really between just the metacarpals and the phalangeals. So it's like your knuckles. So think about your knuckles are going to be, and maybe I guess you have knuckles on the phalanges too, but it's between your metacarpals and your phalanges, and that's the only place where you're going to see a condyloid here. And it has multiple kind of movements. You can kind of turn them a little bit. So you can see some of the different types of movements that they do. So in a couple of different planes, so you can do those in, gives you a lot of different movement possibilities. Your thumb your opposable thumbs, it basically makes like they call this a saddle joint, because in a saddle you have a curve like this, where there's the horn that you hold on to, but then it's curving this way, convex as well. So there's like a part of the saddle kind of bends down and forms a convex in one direction and concave in the other direction. And so that's what you're seeing here. So there's the convex, and here's the concave, and they kind of intertwine, and that gives you the ability to do several different, like 2 different planes that you can move that in. So that's what gives you an opposable thumb. Pivot joint here is found at the radius and the ulna, so radio-ulnar, and the atlanto-axial. So between the atlas and the axial. And then your ball and socket, this is going to be, oops. And your ball and socket here, you're going to have the shoulder and your hip. So this would be like these are major joints that get replaced: knee, elbow, and interphalangeal, or interfinger joints. And then this is it's in your wrist, gliding joint. And then another wrist sort of thing, the saddle, is just your thumb and carpals, a specific carpal, the trapezium, and the metacarpal. So that's one that's specifically going to interact with your metacarpal. Between the other metacarpals and the phalanges, that's the condyloid. So these are kind of like your knuckles. And the pivot joint is going to be at your head and neck, and at your proximal radial ulnar end of your bone that kind of allows you to supinate and pronate. So hopefully that's a good list for you, and you need to know the names of these bones that form them. I've given you, these are more common names out here so that you can kind of get a sense, oh yeah, I know where the knuckles are. Oh yeah, I know where my wrist is. I know, where my thumb is. But that, you need to know these names as well. So think about where these names are, where these bones are actually located. So that's the end of chapter 9.